Hello, and welcome to this episode of Counsel Trends. I'm Dr. Shauna Anderson, and I'm with the lovely Dr. Mercy Connors. And I am really excited about the article that we are covering today.
Yes.
It's on moral injury.
Yeah.
And I just have to share, I learned about moral injury years ago.
Mm-hmm.
My mentor in trauma was Dr. John Briere, and he just one day said, Shauna, you have to read this book. And I actually pulled it out. It's called Achilles in Vietnam: Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character. And it compares the soldiers in Homer's Iliad to the soldiers in the Vietnam War.
Wow.
And that is the first time I had ever even heard about moral injury. And it just rocked me.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to actually reread it now after reading this article.
Yes.
So this article, it is called Moral Trauma, Moral Distress, Moral Injury, and Moral Injury Disorder, Definitions and Assessments. And it is from Frontiers in Psychology, and it was published in March of 2025. And so I think a lot of people have never even heard of moral injury.
Yes, it is a newer thing, but I love also too that this is parsing it out a lot more, which I feel like that's one of the things. It's about definitions and assessments, which I feel like is very, very helpful for people to understand the broad concept, but then these nuances that we're now seeing within the clinical field.
And that's where I'm just going to start off by just kind of talking about the different definitions of moral injury.
Yes.
And one of the first ones was that moral injury involves an act of transgression, either perpetrated, witnessed, or experienced as an act of betrayal that violates deeply held assumptions and beliefs about right and wrong or personal goodness. So it's really something that you experience when you have to do something, or you do something, or see something, or are a victim of something that goes against your moral code.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting too, because it's also you can have a moral injury when you don't intervene.
Right.
So say you know that something is wrong and you don't intervene when you do this. And the thing that comes to my mind is like World War II and the Holocaust. That's what comes to my mind, is that, there were probably a lot of people that knew something was happening, but they didn't intervene, and how much moral injury was happening, not only within the soldiers, which I hope some was happening within the soldiers, but also within the population around some of these camps or around some of these situations.
And I think that's a really good example of somebody kind of witnessing, knowing it happened, that can cause a moral injury. Yep. But it also, I think it speaks a lot to perpetrators. And I know when I work with trauma, so many of my patients are like, the question that comes up all the time, how could they have done this to me?
Yeah.
And I think it really speaks to, and this is why I think it was originally created from the Vietnam veterans, of people who have maybe had to do things that violated their moral core because their, commanding officer told them to do that.
Yeah.
And we know that we were seeing a lot of this during COVID.
Yep.
We've seen a lot of this with like doctors and nurses and having to do maybe abortions, of doing things that violate their morality.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting too, because we're even seeing this in the mental health field too, how different states are requiring different things that may violate somebody's sincerely held religious beliefs. Also too, as our world keeps getting older, we keep going down this moral tubes in a way, with now not only are we seeing this with abortion, but now with euthanasia.
Yes.
And, we keep seeing these things where these things keep coming to the forefront that are really going up against our morality, going up against what we know is wrong and right.
Which is why I think it's interesting that moral injury is really beginning to step into the realm of where we're discussing it a lot, because it almost seems like it's happening in response to the moral decay that we're seeing in the culture.
Yes.
Because I'm reading through the article going, how many people actually do have a moral code anymore if it's not rooted, I think, in God? I mean, obviously people can still have morals and they're atheistic.
Well, if you think about it too, even codes of ethics have morals attached to them. You know, when you think about the medical code, you know, we always think of it first, do no harm, right? That doesn't come from, you know, something religious. That is a medical code that comes from actually Hammurabi's code of ethics. I think it was Hammurabi. I'm going to check that later. But
Was that Hippocrates?
Hippocrates.
Hippocrates.
Yes.
Yeah. The Hippocratic Oath.
The Hippocratic Oath. There we go. Knew it started with an H.
We're talking about the Iliad.
Yeah,
we're like way back in Greek history today.
That's right. But, you know, I think it's very, very interesting because I do think people who would say I'm non-religious or I'm a-religious, or they still have some type of morality.
But that's where I think it gets very interesting. And I was thinking as I was reading through this whole article in terms of moral injury, I can really see some people having moral injury from something that another person would say, are you kidding me? I would never have moral injury over that.
Right. Yeah, and again, that can be definitely connected to their spirituality or their religions specifically. You know, I'm even thinking, you know, in certain Eastern cultures, you know, not killing a cow is very important to them. But they come over to, you know, the United States and they see hamburgers everywhere. You know, again, that could be a moral injury that they experience.
Well, so what they did in this is they looked at, I'd love to actually backtrack. The way they did this article is they gathered kind of the top people in the field of moral injury and brought them together. They met regularly for about a year and really kind of wrestled with ideas around definitions and concepts and maybe even a potential assessment scale.
Yes.
And what they found, I'm going to go through some of their new definitions. The definitions that they came up with for moral injury is persistent distress that arises from a personal experience that disrupts or threatens one's sense of the goodness of oneself, of others, of institutions, or of what are understood to be higher powers or God. And then B, one's beliefs or intuitions about right, wrong, or good or evil.
That is really big. Like
It's a huge definition.
But when you think about it, like, you know, I'm even just thinking just the understanding of the goodness of people, like going back to attachment, right? You know, attachment's a lot about am I good or are you good, that type of thing. Like this, I can see this even being very connected to attachment.
Well, it's interesting because I was even taking it back further of thinking biblically, we are not good.
Right.
We are born into sin.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering how that looks for Christians who really recognize that we are sinful people, that we are not operating from a place of goodness. And the only thing that's good in us is Christ.
Right. That's a really good concept.
But it is interesting because I do think that there are certain things that will happen that can tap into a moral injury. And what did they call them? There was, I think it was like potential moral injury. What do they call it? Moral trauma. And is something have that potential to bring about a moral injury?
Yes.
They also talked about moral distress, which is a different definition. Do you want to read that one?
So moral distress, they came up with distress that arises because personal experience disrupts or threatens one's sense of the goodness of oneself, of others, of institutions, or of what are understood to be higher powers or God, and B, one's beliefs or institutions or intuitions about right and wrong or good and evil. And one of the things that I want to pull up here, and they talked about it a little bit with the new definition of moral injury, is that this isn't just a moral dilemma. You know how we talk about that in, in medical ethics, in mental health ethics, we talk about these dilemmas.
Of like, what do I do?
Right. But this is talking not just about dilemmas. This is talking about you have to make a decision that goes, or you have to make a decision or not act that goes against what you think you should do.
Exactly. And that is, I think, really the crux of it.
Yeah.
And persistent moral distress. So being in a situation where, again, you are having to do something witness something, or be the victim of something that goes completely against your morals, the longer and the more serious that is, that will cause the moral injury.
Yes. So it's and I think it's very interesting because they were talking about moral injury is persistent moral distress. So you may experience something that is morally distressing, but it may not cause a moral injury. But when you have some of these other symptoms of where now you question your belief system, now you're not sure what you think is right or good.
And you feel guilt and shame. Yes, it's so powerful.
Yeah.
And then the next definition that they included is something called morally traumatic experience. So this is really pinpointing that experience is a personal experience that disrupts or threatens one's sense of the goodness of oneself, of others, of institutions, and what's understood to be higher powers or God. And then again, B, one's beliefs or intuitions about right, wrong, good, and evil. So it's really the morally traumatic experience that causes the moral distress. And if that distress is intense enough for long enough, it causes moral injury.
Right. And I love that they actually put this in here because I do think that people will experience morally traumatic experiences, but it doesn't necessarily go into moral injury.
Right.
I think they're really parsing out that this has to be persistent. This has to be affecting multiple areas of your life. And they describe it as, family, work, socializing, things like that, which I did appreciate from a diagnostic perspective because it really does help you parse out, okay, yes, this happened to you, but it doesn't seem to be affecting you all day, every day, that type of thing.
Which actually leads us right into the next thing that they talked about is moral injury disorder. Do you want to read that one?
And this one is persistent distress that arises because of a personal experience that disrupts or threatens A, one's sense of the goodness of oneself or of others, of institutions, or of what are understood to be higher powers or God. B, one's beliefs or institutions about right or intuitions about what is right and wrong or good and evil so as to cause impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning in ways that are out of proportion or inconsistent with cultural or religious norms concerning such experiences.
So what do you think about that? What do you think about actually creating a disorder in the DSM that is tied to moral injury?
I see there being some good there and some bad there.
Yes.
I think whenever we get a new disorder within the DSM, then I feel like there's we have to have all these evidence-based practices around that, and we have to now quantify it, and we now have to figure out this systematic way to fix it. And I feel like moral injury it's kind of like, and it even describes it here, it's kind of like prolonged grief disorder, right? That can be something that is exacerbated by various different things. Like, for example, if somebody has a morally traumatic experience at MTE, and it's affecting them, but then that experience happens again, and then it happens again. It's almost like that prolonged grief response. Like, we know that sometimes that happens because there's multiple losses that happens within grief. If you lose your husband, well, now you've lost his income. Now you've lost, what I'm saying? It's that snowball effect. So do I feel like, yes, it's helpful, but I also am a little bit leery of mental health and coming in with that evidence-based practices because this has to do with morality.
Well, and that's where they even talked about in here of the importance of how a lot of the people involved originally in this work were chaplains and people from religious backgrounds, because you are looking at, on some levels, as we see, spiritual levels, religious issues.
Yes.
But what I thought was interesting how they tied it into how it's similar and dissimilar from PTSD.
Yes, that was very interesting.
That's where I have noticed a bunch of my patients, because I do work with complex trauma, and most of my patients have trauma from being abused by people that they were supposed to trust. These people were supposed to look out for their best interest and love them. So not only do they have PTSD with the intrusions and the avoidance and the hypervigilance, but there is this moral injury of they constantly wonder, how could this happen? How did God allow this to happen?
Yeah.
What was wrong with me that my parents hated me so much? I mean, I remember when I struggled with those things of, why did my parents hate me so much? Because they had to have, in order to treat me this way,
Right.
is the way in which I understood what had happened to me.
Right.
And so I think it's already getting put in there in PTSD a little bit,
Right.
under criterion D, where it talks about, grief or it talks about guilt and shame
Yes. Yep.
and self-blame and things like that. But this is really expanding it to include, which I think is so important, the witnesses and the perpetrators who may not have anything tied with PTSD or any other symptoms after the fact.
Right.
That it just is that moral devastation.
Yeah, and I feel like it also gives rise to people to say, yes, there are things that affect me spiritually, which then therefore affects me mentally, that therefore affects me medically. As we know, that shame and that guilt does have some biological effects as
Right.
well, too. So it's almost like it gives rise to the fact that being injured spiritually can also affect you in these various different ways. And it allows for that to be more of a conversation. It allows for people to say, there are things in my life that I don't understand where God was.
Right.
And if I don't understand where God was, like, he's all powerful and all of this, why did this happen? Or why was I put in this situation? Or I didn't act when I knew I should. Does God hate me now?
Yes. Well, and they talk in here about how moral injury is seen a lot in nursing. And I think probably having to maybe witness things and partake in things that maybe the hospital is telling them they have to do.
Yep.
And I don't know if we want to go here, but I'm going to go here. I'm thinking back in COVID. I know many people that did not want to get the vaccine, but were faced with either losing their job
Yeah.
and the main income for their family,
Yes.
or potentially, having medical complications from getting vaccinated. And I do know many people that have struggled with moral injury as a result of the decisions they made or didn't make.
Yes, yes. And I can see that. That makes complete sense because I think that this is where, again, it's an institution, specifically talking about institutions that are making these choices that as a person I would not make. There were times even when I worked in clinical settings that I didn't act because I knew that my institution would not have my back if I did
so
act
scary.
in that certain way. And so therefore I knew what to do and I didn't do it. And that was literally one of the times I'll give a personal story. So I was doing an assessment with a woman. She had just recently found out that her daughter had been molested by a very close family friend. The daughter was between 8 and 6. I'm not sure the age. And, at the end, I had talked to her about, do you go to church anywhere? No, I don't. So I'm trying to open that door to the spirituality. And this mom is just, you can see it all over her face. She is just broken for her daughter. And in my heart, as I was ending that assessment, I was like, I need to tell her I'm praying for her because it was the only thing I could do.
Yeah.
I wasn't taking the case. I was doing the assessment, but somebody else was taking the case. And I knew that my institution wouldn't be happy with that. And so I didn't say it. And I literally got in my car and I drove to a gas station that was like a minute away. And I broke down crying.
Oh.
And I called my husband. I said, I can't do this anymore. I have to work in a Christian place where I can bring my faith in. And that was it. I was done. I literally put in my notice. I never went and did it again. Because to me, I knew that was right to do that, and I didn't do it.
Wow. Would you say it was a moral injury?
I would say it was definitely a morally traumatic event.
Yes, yes. But you bring up an excellent point here that I think as we're talking about this, you have a strength in you that I think after that you're like, I'm done.
Yep.
I'm not going to do this anymore. So the persistence, like it talks about this, the persistence of that distress, you stopped it. It sounds like you knew this was injurious. I'm not going to talk about it, or I'm not going to tolerate it anymore. And I'm wondering, because of that, you did not have a long-term moral injury disorder.
I think so. I think the other fact too, and I mean, even as I'm talking about this, I can feel the sadness and the wanting to cry about it, because I can still feel that. I can still see that woman's face, and I'm like, that's where the persistence is. Even though I messed up there, I'm not continuing to do it. I'm not continuing to engage in that. It's actually very interesting. I'm even, in a way, it spurred me to work in another direction where I'm trying to get that freedom for other people, to be able to have those conversations with people, whether it's a secular institution or a Christian institution. These conversations need to be had, and just that support, for people to do these things. That is just basic human decency.
Exactly. Well, what I thought was interesting is they actually came up with some items for a future assessment. And what I really liked about this is they did a generic one, and then they have one that is actually separated into, there's one assessment that they say a moral trauma perpetrator symptoms, one for witnesses and one for victims. And I just thought it might be helpful. So some of the questions that people might endorse if they're actually a perpetrator and ended up having to do something that they felt was against their morals is that I feel guilt over having acted immorally. I feel ashamed about what I did or did not do. Because I acted wrongly, I've betrayed who I am as a person. I'm struggling to forgive myself because of what I did. And I think that this is such an important component, I think, that is being neglected in, I think, psychological care of when we do things that we feel bad about. Because I just think of how many times, even just as clinicians, we're just like, oh, no, it's okay.
Yeah.
Don't feel bad.
Yeah.
And it goes so much deeper when we have crossed a moral boundary.
Yeah. And I think it's also, too, that you know who you are. Like, one of the things that our client care makes us do is we have to really know who we are, not only as a person, but as a clinician. And then, when you get into these situations, like, for example, mine, where I knew who I was. I knew that I'm a believer in Jesus Christ, and that the offering of prayer would have been a good thing for that person. Yes, they could have gotten mad at me. They could have, put a complaint against my license for asking, for saying that or whatever. But I didn't do it. I didn't do it out of fear. I didn't do it out of, well, I don't want this to blow back on other people. I was being supervised at that time. I didn't want that to hurt my supervisor's license. So there was all of these things of the reasons why. Do I still know that was wrong? And does it still, do I, in a way, like, if I thought about these, I would say, I was filled with hopelessness because of my wrong action. Yeah, I was, but then I took action afterwards. I said, no, I'm done. Like, I'm not going to do this anymore. So, I think it's interesting. I love the assessment. I think it's really important for us to think about moral injury wider.
Yes, I agree.
It's not just this thing that happens for nurses or for Vietnam vets or medical or mental health. I mean, this can happen in a broad, I'm thinking people who are in the financial industries, and they're like, hey, just, don't put that on the ledger. That's a moral injury when your boss comes in and says, hey, erase that.
Right.
So this is broader. And
which I really like, because I like how they included the perpetrators, the witnesses, and the victims, because it's all three components of things that happen that can be traumatic, that actually activate that moral trauma. What I thought was also interesting is that they highlighted at the very end of the article that there was a recent change in the DSM. In December 2024, the American Psychiatric Association took a historic step by approving the addition of moral to the religious or spiritual problem category in the section of other conditions that may be a focus of clinical attention. So we know that there's a V code that clinicians can use if you're working on religious, spiritual issues. I love that they added moral to that.
Yes, yeah, because I think that hits something else. It does. It hits a different piece. Yes, it could be connected to your religion and spirituality, but it could be separate, you know, and so I think that that's really, really helpful. But this one was very, very great. It was a great one.
I'm really excited to see where this is going to go. I hope that this was helpful, maybe introducing you for the first time to moral injury. Keep our eyes open to what's going to happen in the future with it. But if you liked this topic, please give us a thumbs up. Subscribe to our weekly videos that we do. If you have any other suggestions for topics that you'd like to see, please list that. And Mercy, close us out.
Well, we just want you to know that we love being a part of your life.